Close your eyes and you can easily see it. It's a cozy room, drenched in semi-darkness. The logs crackle merrily in the huge fireplace, casting dancing glows on the roughly chipped tables. The bearded, good-natured innkeeper wipes a wooden mug. In the corner sits a mysterious wanderer wrapped in a cloak, and at a nearby table, a group of merry mercenaries chant a song while raising foaming glasses. The air smells of roasted meat, ale, and wood smoke. This is the image of a medieval tavern, firmly rooted in our minds thanks to fantasy novels, movies, and computer games. It is a place of relaxation, adventure, and comfort. But what if I told you that this image is a lie? A convenient, romantic fantasy that has almost nothing to do with the dirty, noisy, dangerous, and surprisingly versatile reality of a medieval English tavern. What if a real inn was not so much a place of recreation as the center of all social, economic, and even criminal life? Are you ready to set aside the myths and look behind the boar's head sign to see what really smelled, drank, and risked in these establishments? The answers lie in the details that historians reconstruct from court records, poems, and archaeological evidence. This is the story of a world where there was no difference between a bar, a labor exchange, and a courtroom. Where beer was food and the hostess was most often a woman. Where you could be a pilgrim and a murderer in the same bed. Stay tuned and you'll find out why you wouldn't drink the local ale. Why the tavern owner was one of the most powerful women in town. What food lurked beneath the thick pie crust. Why the tavern was both a bank and a morgue. How the church was a major competitor to drinking establishments, hosting its own alcoholic festivals. This is a journey into the heart of medieval society, a real English tavern. The first and foremost myth that needs to be busted is the word tavern itself. We use it to refer to any medieval drinking establishment. But for a person of that era, the difference between the three main types of such places was huge and fundamental. They were alehouse, tavern, and inn, and each of them served its own clientele, performed its own functions, and had its own unique appearance and legal status. The most common, basic, and democratic establishment was the alehouse. It was not a separate pub in our sense, but simply a private house where the landlady, most often a woman, Alewife, brewed ale and sold the surplus to her neighbors. The alehouse was an extension of her kitchen. The only sign was the ale stake, a long pole with a green bush or a bundle of straw tied to it, which was put out of a window or attached to a wall. This pole was so ubiquitous that its length was even regulated by law so that it would not interfere with the passage of horsemen through narrow streets. There was no bar or individual tables inside. People sat on rough benches, barrels, or simply on the floor of the common room, among the household utensils and running children, drinking ale from their mugs or common vessels. There was little or no food served here except a piece of bread. It was a place exclusively for locals, for farmers and artisans who gathered after work to discuss news, gossip, and drink a few mugs of cheap home-brewed ale. Elk houses were everywhere, in almost every village. It was the informal, almost unlicensed basis of the whole drinking culture. One step higher was the tavern. Taverns were mostly located in towns and were more respectable establishments that required a special license to trade. The key difference was the drink. While alehouses sold only ale, taverns specialized in selling imported wine. Wine was an expensive drink, available only to wealthy townspeople, merchants, clergy, and nobility. Accordingly, the audience in taverns was more wealthy. There could be separate tables, better quality pewter, or even silverware, and sometimes simple but good quality food. Taverns often had recognizable signs with designs. Boar's head, swan, as their clientele was more mobile and often illiterate. Taverns were more often owned by men, often wine merchants themselves, and the premises were specifically designed for commerce rather than being part of a dwelling house. It was a place for business meetings, where merchants made deals over a glass of French or Spanish wine. Finally, at the top of the hierarchy was the inn. These were the largest and most versatile establishments, located on the main roads or in major cities. By law, they were obliged to accept any traveler if they had room and could pay. The inn was an entire complex, often built around a courtyard with galleries which provided security for wagons with goods and horses. It included common halls for eating and drinking, separate rooms for especially noble guests, stables, and storage rooms. It was inns, such as the famous Tabard of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, where the paths of people from all walks of life crossed. They served both ale and wine and offered a more varied menu. Owning an inn was a lucrative and respectable business. Thus, when a medieval man went out for a drink, he made a choice that determined his drink, his company, and his social status. Mixing these three concepts is like not seeing the difference between a neighbor's garage where craft beer is brewed, a city wine bar, and a large hotel complex with a restaurant. Forget the image of a cold, clear, bitter pint of beer with a puffy foam cap. The beverage that formed the basis of the diet and was the staple at the alehouses had almost nothing in common with it. It was ale, a thick, cloudy, often warm or room temperature, sweet-smelling drink that was not so much a way to get intoxicated as an important part of the diet, liquid bread, and a vital source of safe hydration. The key difference between medieval English ale and modern beer was the absence of hops. Hops, which give beer its bitterness, flavor, and serve as a natural preservative, began to be widely used in England only in the 15th centuries. Before that, a complex mixture of herbs and spices known as grate was used to preserve and flavor ale. It could include heather, wormwood, yarrow, marshmallow, ginger, and cinnamon. The most surprising thing is that some of these herbs, for example, ledum or bilberry, which could be added in very small doses, had psychoactive properties. This means that the intoxication from such an ale was different than purely alcoholic. It could be more euphoric, stupefying, or even slightly hallucinogenic. The brewing process was a complex art. The female brewer first germinated the barley, malted it, then dried it in the kiln. The degree of drying affected the color and taste, from light to dark, almost like a porter. The malt was then milled and mixed with hot water in a large caddy, producing a sweet wort. All of this was boiled, killing bacteria from poor quality water, so it was much safer to drink ale than water. The wort was fermented with yeast, which was often just left in the fermentation barrel from the previous batch. The ale was not filtered, so it was cloudy, full of grain and yeast particles. This made it incredibly nutritious, rich in B vitamins and carbohydrates. The calorie content of ale was comparable to that of bread, and for a poor man whose diet was meager, a few cups of ale a day was an important source of energy. It was so important that it was often part of the wage. Laborers were paid not only in money, but also with several liters of ale a day. There were two main types of ale. The first, the strongest and best quality, was made from the first infusion of wort. It was intended for sale or for the Lord's table. The same grain was then infused with water again to produce what was known as small ale, a light, almost non-alcoholic drink that everyone, including children and field workers, drank to quench their thirst. The flavor of this drink would be unusual for us, sweetish, thick, like liquid porridge, with spicy herbal notes. It was drunk fresh, because without hops it would quickly spoil, souring in a few days. That's why brewing was a constant, almost daily process, and the sign 6 at the alehouse meant that a fresh batch was ready. Trying to drink such a beverage today would probably end in disappointment. But to a man of that era, it was a taste of home, satiety, security, and life itself. The image of a heavy, mustachioed innkeeper wiping down the bar is a later cliché, largely shaped by 19th century literature. In reality, especially in the world of the ubiquitous alehouses, the main figure was a woman, the alewife, or brewer. Brewing was one of the few crafts that gave a woman economic independence, considerable social weight, and at the same time, made her the object of constant suspicion. Home brewing was a natural extension of a woman's household duties. Every housewife knew how to bake bread and brew ale for her family. If she was particularly skilled at it, and the family had a surplus of grain, she could start selling her product to her neighbors. Her kitchen became an alehouse. It was an ideal home business. It required no separate premises, no large investment, and allowed you to combine work with childcare and home care. Brewing as a craft was often practiced by widows, for whom it was the only way to support themselves after the death of their husbands. They used their main skill to survive. Alewife was a central figure in the life of a village or urban neighborhood. She didn't just sell a drink, her house became the center of social news and gossip. She knew everyone and everything about everyone. She could act as an informal banker, pouring in a loan until payday. She could be a matchmaker, making introductions. Her reputation was her greatest asset. A good brewer who brewed tasty and strong ale was respected by all. She had to have a whole set of tools: large cauldrons, caddies, stirring oars, and most importantly, official, certified measures, quarts, gallons, to prove her honesty. However, the profession also had a dark side. In satirical literature and court records, the Alewife was often portrayed in a negative light. She was accused of all the deadly sins: diluting ale with water, underpouring it into mugs, using double-bottom jugs, inflating prices, buying stolen goods, and even running a brothel. William Langland's poem, The Vision of Peter the Plowman, paints a vivid image of Betty the brewer who cheats her customers. She was often depicted as a witch, a woman alone in the house, bent over a boiling cauldron of herbs, an image easily transformed into a sinister one. If a batch of ale went sour, it could easily be attributed to witchcraft. These accusations were partly fair. The temptation to cheat a tipsy customer was great. But in many ways, it was a reflection of male anxiety about women's economic independence. A woman who had her own income, was the center of male company, and wielded informal power was suspect in a patriarchal society. Despite this, the Alewife remained an integral and influential part of medieval society throughout the centuries, and it is she, rather than the fictional bearded man, who should be considered the true symbol of the medieval drinking establishment. If you walked into a medieval tavern hoping for a hearty dinner of roast boar and freshly baked bread, you would be sorely disappointed. Gastronomic delights were not for these establishments. The food, if served at all, was simple, utilitarian, and often of dubious quality. Its main purpose was not to give pleasure, but to stifle hunger and serve as an appetizer to drink. In most village alehouses, there was no food at all. The most you could be offered was a piece of yesterday's stale bread and maybe some cheese. Bread was the main appetizer, dipped in ale to soak it up. However, in the cities, taverns also played the role of medieval fast food. Many townspeople, especially journeymen, apprentices, or lone artisans, lived in rooms without their own kitchens. For them, the tavern was the only place where they could get a hot meal. Therefore, the street kitchens of the taverns offered takeout food: hot meat pies, sausages, roasted poultry. In the larger city taverns and inns, the menu was more varied, but not by much. The mainstay of the cuisine was the eternal soup or pottage. In a large cauldron over a fire, a soup based on water or broth was constantly boiling, where during the day and even several days in a row, everything that was at hand was thrown in. Root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, onions, beans, leftover meat, bones. This soup was never poured out, only refilled with water and added new ingredients. It was hearty and hot, but its flavor and composition were a mystery even to the cook. Another popular dish was pies. But a pie in medieval times was not a delicate treat. It was essentially an edible container. The thick, hard dough, often made of rye flour and lard, served to bake the filling inside and keep it juicy. Often this dough was not even eaten, but was opened like a tin can, and only the contents were eaten. But the contents could be anything, beef or game at best. But taverns were notorious for using meat of the most dubious origin. There was a black market for poached game, and the venison in your pie could have been illegally harvested. Worse, all sorts of giblets, trimmings, and meat from animals that had died of disease were used. Heavy spices such as pepper, ginger, and cloves were generously added to the stuffing, not so much for flavor as to overpower the smell and taste of stale meat. Stories of cat or dog pies were probably exaggerations, but they reflected a general distrust of the quality of inn-food. Hygiene in the kitchen was virtually non-existent. Meat was often stale, spoiled by flies. The utensils, wooden bowls and tin mugs, were washed poorly, if at all. Often they were simply wiped with a rag. They were eaten by hand and with a personal knife. Forks were considered a pampered Italian fad. A trencher, a thick slice of stale bread on which meat was placed, was often used as a plate. It absorbed the juices, and after the meal, it could be eaten by itself or thrown to the dogs that ran under the tables. One of the most common fines imposed on innkeepers was for selling spoiled or poor quality food. For example, for overbaked bread, underbaked pies, and stale ale. The traveler had to rely on luck and the strength of his stomach. The saying, "God sends meat and the devil sends cooks," was born in such establishments. Forget the cleanly swept floors and the smell of wood shavings. The real atmosphere of a medieval tavern was a sensory assault on modern man, a real test of his senses and nerves. It was a dark, smelly, noisy, and often dangerous place. Half darkness. The windows, if there were any, remained small and dim to keep the heat in. They were often covered with oiled cloth or ox blood, which let in only a murky, yellowish light. The main source of light was an open hearth, which smoked mercilessly, as chimneys were a rarity and a luxury. The air was thick with smoke, soot, and greasy fumes from the food being cooked. In this semi-darkness, it was difficult to see faces, which on the one hand created an intimate atmosphere for clandestine transactions, and on the other hand, facilitated the commission of crimes. The tallow candles or oil lamps were expensive and used sparingly. So much of the room was drowned in darkness. Dirt and stench. The floor was earthen or stone, and it was covered with straw, reeds, or grasses. This bedding was supposed to absorb dirt, moisture, and give a pleasant odor, but in practice it was the opposite. This bedding was rarely changed, maybe once every few months. Food scraps, spilled ale, spit, bones, vomit, and other debris were trampled into it. Over time, it began to rot, turning into a stinky, sticky mass infested with fleas, lice, and other parasites. Erasmus of Rotterdam described English floors as follows. The bottom layer remains untouched for 20 years, hiding spit, vomit, dog and human urine, spilled beer, fish bones, and other indescribable filth. The odor of unwashed, sweaty bodies, wet woolen clothes, musty ale, and poorly cleaned night pots added to it. This thick, layered stench was the hallmark of any crowded place. Noise. Quiet gatherings by the fire were almost non-existent. Taverns were incredibly noisy. People didn't talk. They shouted to block out the general buzz, arguing, bargaining, singing rude songs. To this was added the sharp clatter of wooden cups against tables, the cracking of dice, and the barking and shrieking of dogs fighting over a thrown bone. The acoustics in the low, stone or wooden rooms were terrible, and the din was so loud that one had to shout to be heard. Violence, alcohol, gambling, and every man carrying a knife or dagger were an explosive mix. Court records are replete with records of fights and murders that occurred in taverns. An argument over a game of dice, a careless word, an insult. All of these could instantly escalate into a stabbing. Honor in those days was a very specific concept, and only blood could wash away an insult. The tavern was a place where social breaks were released and primal aggression came out. Dying in a tavern from a dagger in a drunken brawl was commonplace. It wasn't a place for family vacations, but a harsh territory where you had to be on guard at all times and know how to stand up for yourself. In fantasy, a tavern is a place where heroes gather as a team, receive a quest from a mysterious stranger, and set out to save the world. In reality, the tavern was a magnet for the darkest and most dubious elements of society. For the authorities, it was a place requiring constant supervision, and for the law-abiding and especially the naive citizen, a place of high risk. Underworld. Taverns and alehouses were natural habitats for the underworld. Here, thieves and robbers sold stolen goods, planned their next deeds, and recruited accomplices. There were entire manuals on fraud, so-called horse catching, rabbit catching, where the rabbit is a naive victim. The swindlers worked in groups using dice, speckled cards, and elaborate psychological tricks to beat a visiting merchant or young aristocrat and leave him penniless. The tipsy traveler was easy prey for them. He could have been robbed of his drink with sleeping pills, or simply mugged in a dark alley on his way out of the tavern. The innkeeper was often in cahoots with the criminals, taking his share of the spoils and providing them with shelter. Prostitution. Taverns were closely associated with prostitution. Although formally condemned, many establishments were in fact brothels in disguise. Free women, or as they were called in London, Winchester geese, because the brothels in the Southwark area were under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Winchester, found clients here. Often they worked in collusion with an innkeeper who would provide them with an upstairs room and security in exchange for a share of their earnings. For many poor women, widows or orphans, this was one of the few ways to survive. The authorities looked the other way, preferring to keep prostitution concentrated in certain places where it could be controlled and taxed in some way. Gambling. The church and the authorities condemned gambling, but it was played in taverns all the time. They played dice, cards when they appeared, checkers and backgammon. Bets were placed not only on games, but also on violent amusements such as cockfights or bear baiting, which were often held in the tavern's backyard. Games were played for money and were often unfair. Losing could lead to a debt hole, and arguing over debt or cheating could lead to fighting and murder. Espionage and conspiracy. In turbulent times of political intrigue and rebellion, taverns became centers of espionage and subversion. Here, in noisy and anonymous crowds, conspirators met to discuss their plans. It was also where the authorities and lords sent their spies to eavesdrop on conversations and identify the unreliable. A drunken man was a spy's catch. He could easily divulge important secrets. A careless word about a king or local lord spoken in a tavern could be overheard and reported to the authorities, often leading to the scaffold. Thus, a tavern visitor, especially a traveler, risked not only his wallet, but also his life and freedom. It was a place where one had to keep one's ear to the ground, one's tongue behind one's teeth, and one's hand on the hilt of one's dagger. For the modern traveler, a private hotel room with its own bathroom is a basic necessity. For a traveler in a medieval inn, the very idea of privacy would have been an incomprehensible luxury. Overnight lodging was collective, discomforting, and full of danger. It was not a rest, but only a short respite in the struggle for survival on the journey. When a traveler stayed overnight in an inn, he paid not for a room, but for a place in a bed. And by bed was meant not a bed as we understand it, but a huge straw mattress or wide wooden bunks located in a common sleeping room, dormitory. On such a bed could sleep up to 10 or 20 people at a time. Men, women, strangers, all in a heap. You went to bed in the same clothes you were traveling in, putting your wallet and most valuable things under your head. You could be next to anyone, a pious pilgrim, a snoring merchant, a coughing sick man, or a thief just waiting for you to fall asleep. At night, there was unimaginable noise in the common bedroom. Snoring, coughing, moaning, sleep-talking, children crying. The air was foggy and heavy with the breath of dozens of people. There was even a hierarchy of sleeping. The poorest simply slept on the floor of the common room, on the same dirty straw on which they walked during the day. A little more expensive was a place on the bunks or on the common mattress. Even more expensive was a share in a real bed, which had to be shared with 2 or 3 strangers. In the busiest urban inns, the hot bed system was practiced. A place in a bed was rented out for a certain number of hours. As soon as one worker got up to go to his shift, his still warm place was immediately taken by another. The biggest inconvenience was the vermin. The straw bunks, which were rarely changed, were crawling with fleas, bedbugs, and lice. You would wake up in the morning covered in itchy bites. It was so commonplace that it was hardly noticed. Stories of travelers trying to fight bedbugs were a popular subject of anecdotes. Communal sleeping quarters were also an ideal environment for the spread of disease, from scabies to tuberculosis to plague. The inn was a crossroads not only for people, but also for infections. The main danger was theft. To fall into a sound sleep in such company meant almost certainly to lose one's purse. Experienced travelers slept very lightly or took turns with their companions. Some tied their belongings to an arm or leg. Of course, very rich and noble guests could find a separate room, the so-called private chamber. But this was an exception, costing a great deal of money. For the majority of people, a night's lodging was just that, collective and unsafe. Even the famous Great Bed of Ware, a huge late 16th century bed designed to accommodate 8 people, is an echo of this tradition of collective sleeping. The practice was dictated not only by space conservation, but also by safety concerns. Sleeping alone in a private room could be even more dangerous in those days. A lone traveler was easy prey for robbers. Sleeping in a common room, for all its disadvantages, created the illusion of safety in a crowd. Contrary to the image of absolutely wild and lawless places, taverns and alehouses were under close and constant supervision by both secular and ecclesiastical authorities. The state saw them as a source of taxation and a potential breeding ground for disorder, and the church as a nest of sin and moral corruption. This control manifested itself in a variety of ways, making the innkeeper's life a constant game with the law. The main instrument of state regulation was the assize of bread and ale, first introduced in the 13th century. This law established a strict relationship between the price of grain and the price at which brewers could sell their ale. Special officials, ale conners, were appointed in each town and village. It was their duty to go around the alehouses, taste a fresh batch of ale, and give a verdict on its quality and fair price. If the ale was too weak, cloudy, or sour, or if the owner sold it at an inflated price, she was punished severely. Most often it was a fine, but for repeated offenses, public humiliation could also be applied. The cheater was put on a shameful chair, cucking stool, and dunked in the nearest pond or river to the ridicule of the crowd. The authorities also tried to regulate the opening hours of drinking establishments. They were ordered to close at curfew when the church bell rang to signal that everyone should be at home. Taverns were supposed to be closed at night to prevent nighttime debauchery and crime. In practice, however, this rule was often broken, and innkeepers risked being raided by the night watch. Special attention was paid to combating gambling. Laws prohibited innkeepers from allowing dice, cards, and other money games on their premises, especially among commoners and apprentices. The games were thought to distract from work, lead to ruin, and provoke fights. But this prohibition was widely ignored. The authorities also forbade certain forms of entertainment, such as tennis, an early form of the game, or bowling to be kept in taverns, as it distracted men from the compulsory exercise of archery, which was a matter of national security. The church, for its part, waged a constant battle against taverns, seeing them as the main competitor for the souls and wallets of the congregation. Preachers stigmatized drunkenness as a mortal sin and called taverns chapels of the devil. They condemned the songs, dances, and frivolous behavior that prevailed in these establishments. However, as we shall see later, the relationship between the church and alcohol was much more complicated. Tavern owners also had to obtain licenses, especially to sell wine, which was a source of revenue for the crown or local authorities and often led to corruption. Thus, the life of an innkeeper or an alehouse owner was not only full of worries about beer and customers, but also the constant fear of an inspection by an illeconner, a visit from a constable, or an angry sermon from the local priest. It was a highly regulated business where every step was controlled. The most amazing thing about the medieval tavern is its incredible multifunctionality. In the absence of specialized public buildings, the tavern took on the functions of a dozen different institutions. It was not just a place where people came to drink. It was a real center of social and economic life, a universal platform for solving any issues, the third place of medieval man, not home and not work. Labor exchange. The tavern was the main place to find work or hire workers. Seasonal laborers, construction workers, and laborers gathered here waiting to be hired. A wealthy farmer who needed extra hands to harvest his crops, or a merchant looking for movers came here. The deal was made here, over a mug of ale and sealed with a handshake. Business center and office. Merchants and artisans used taverns as informal offices. Here they met with suppliers and customers, discussed prices, and concluded contracts. In port cities, taverns were veritable stock exchanges where ship captains sought freight for their ships and merchants sought transportation for their goods. In the back rooms, craft guilds could meet. Courtroom. Although official courts were held in castles or town halls, many legal procedures took place in the tavern. Coroners investigating sudden deaths often held inquests and interviewed witnesses in the tavern nearest the scene. One can imagine the scene: the body of a drowned man lying on a table, the coroner questioning the ferryman, while the neighboring tables continue to drink ale. Sometimes a jury would also meet here to reach a verdict. Auction house and place of business? The tavern was a place of public auction where everything from livestock and land to the property of debtors was sold and bought. The conclusion of any important transaction, whether it was the sale of a house or a marriage contract, was traditionally concluded by drinking ale together in the tavern. It was a kind of informal confirmation of the contract in the presence of witnesses. Information center. In an era when there were no newspapers, the tavern was the main source of news. The medieval internet. Travelers, pilgrims, and itinerant traders brought news from other cities and countries. Here you could learn about political events, new laws, the price of wool, or the threat of war. Ballads about recent battles or scandals were composed and sung here. Post office and bank. Tavern keepers often acted as letter carriers, receiving and delivering letters and parcels for travelers. They may also have acted as bankers, keeping their regular customers' money and valuables on deposit. Political arena. During elections for parliament or local office, taverns became the headquarters of candidates. Here they served free ale to the voters to gain their support, which often led to scuffles between supporters of different factions. And finally, the most macabre function. If the body of an unknown traveler was found in the village, it was often taken to the nearest tavern, where it lay until the coroner arrived. The tavern was thus temporarily transformed into a morgue. This incredible concentration of functions made the tavern an indispensable element of medieval society. It was a place where the pulse of life beat in all its manifestations, from birth, christening, to death. The church vociferously condemned drunkenness and called taverns synagogues of Satan. Preachers urged the congregation to avoid these nests of vice. But behind the scenes of this righteous struggle, a very different story was unfolding, a story of fierce economic competition. The church was not only the chief moral authority, but also the largest producer and seller of alcohol, and its chief competitor was those very taverns. The monasteries were centers of the most advanced brewing and winemaking technology. The monks brewed the best and strongest ale in the area, which they sold to locals and travelers alike, generating a substantial income. Many abbeys had their own taverns for pilgrims, but the most amazing form of church alcohol business was the so-called church ales. These were large public celebrations organized by the local parish to raise funds. The parish would purchase or brew huge quantities of ale, which was then sold to the parishioners during the festival. These events were incredibly popular. They were accompanied by music, dancing, games, and lavish libations. All the income went to the needs of the church, repairing the building, buying new utensils, and helping the poor. In essence, church ale was a medieval charity festival where alcohol was the main driver of fundraising. This put the church in an ambiguous position. On the one hand, it condemned drunkenness, while on the other hand, it itself drank the flock for financial gain. This competition often erupted into open conflict. Tavern owners complained that church elites were driving away their customers and undermining their business. Church authorities, in turn, could use their influence to impose additional restrictions on private taverns, especially during fasts or major church holidays. This paradox shows how complex and pragmatic relations were in medieval society. For the church, ale was both a devil's temptation and an important source of income. For the common man, the choice between drinking in a dubious tavern or at a pious church feast was not always obvious. The church festival often had more drink and more revelry than the most notorious tavern. This hidden competition between the two main social institutions, the church and the tavern, shaped the social and economic life of medieval England. The medieval English tavern was far from the cozy and romantic image created by our imagination. It was a complex, dirty, noisy, and often dangerous world, yet it played an absolutely central role in the life of the community. It was not just a place to drink, it was a place to live. The alehouse, tavern, and inn were not just bars, but universal community centers that served as a stock exchange, court, post office, bank, and news agency. They were the arena in which all human dramas were played out. Deals were made and plots were hatched, friendships were born and deadly feuds flared up. People found work, love, and death. Studying the real history of the tavern allows us to get rid of myths and see medieval society as it really was. Not black and white, but full of contradictions, where the church which condemned drunkenness was itself the biggest brewer, where a woman could gain economic independence by becoming the owner of an alehouse, where saints and sinners, merchants and thieves coexisted in the same room. The tavern was the heart of this world, and in its noisy, dirty, and lively hum, you can hear the true voice of the Middle Ages. If this journey into the past, full of unexpected discoveries, seemed fascinating to you, and you want to know more about the real life of people in bygone eras, give us a like and subscribe to our channel. There are many more stories ahead of you that break stereotypes and show history as you have never seen it before.